A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we're going to take the opportunity to check the pulse of faith and politics of our friends across the ditch in New Zealand. And very shortly we will open our talkback line. You might like to ask a question. You might have a comment. You might even have a critique for our conversation. You'll be able to call in very shortly. We'll leave our talkback lines closed while we sort of set the foundation for our conversation. But you might recall that last year New Zealanders saw the departure of Jacinda Ardern, who said she had nothing left in the tank and handed what looked like a poison chalice to her successor, Chris Hipkins. Then in the New Zealand election at the end of last year, Labor was swept from office in a landslide, described as one of the most dramatic in history. The new Prime Minister is National Party leader Christopher Luxon. He formed a three-party coalition and moved quickly in implementing reversals of previous policies against the backdrop of economic difficulties, internal coalition divisions, and ongoing social and cultural issues. Well, some insights today from the organisation that we would describe as the equivalent to our Australian Christian lobby in Australia. And Bob McCoskrie is the founder of this organisation. He's founder and national director of Family First New Zealand. He's the spearhead of a strong and unified voice for Christian values to be heard in the corridors of power in New Zealand. Our absolute pleasure to be able to welcome Bob McCoskrie. Hey, Bob, welcome back to 2020.
Hey, Neil, good to be with you again.
Hey, Bob, let's talk about the new Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon. He's made some pretty dramatic changes since taking over the reins.
Yeah, I think that he has come in and wanted to reverse a whole lot of social concerns that there are around crime rates, around declining education standards. There's been concern around health care and whether people can access medical care and even GPs being available. And there's also been a strong push to divide the country. I watched the Voice referendum last year, and in some ways we've been going down that track of division, but not via referendum. It's been effectively by the Labor government at the time were pushing a strong separation and some would argue preferential treatment to the Māori, and so that a lot of that has been tackled. Look, I don't know if you could say that we've solved the problems. They're trying to get more teachers in, they're trying to get more nurses in, they're trying to get more doctors. There's a shortage around the place, and of course the other problem with New Zealand is that we've got a very low fertility rate, which I think Australia has as well, and so we're not replacing our population, and so we're depending on immigrants to come in with certain skills, and it means that, you know, there's still some work to do. Cost of living obviously is a major concern for a lot of people, and the government has recently put out a budget which suggests that they're going to give some tax breaks to a lot of families. Whether that's enough to stave off some of the prices that we're seeing in New Zealand, remains to be seen. So I guess it's a work in process, Neil. What has been interesting to watch has been that the government never really had a honeymoon. As soon as they came in, being a centre-right government, the media went hard after them. And the media is in its own predicament, very tricky predicament, because a lot of them are closing down or having to downscale because media trust from the New Zealand public has plummeted, and people are turning to alternatives, and therefore some of these, one of the main players, TV3, which is part of News Hub, they have closed down their 6 o'clock news program, which of course is a major. That was the only one apart from Television New Zealand. So, but they've gone after the government, haven't given them a holiday, haven't given them a chance to get their feet under the table, and but it is still a work in progress.
And of course, media wants to keep whoever is in government in check. And, we've got our sister organisation, the REMA Broadcasting Group in New Zealand. I imagine they're doing all sorts of things along the lines of addressing the politics and around faith issues as well.
Well, I think what's happened is that there's a void because people are looking for news that they can trust. They also want to hear, I think, both sides of the debate and not be told what to think and how to think. And unfortunately, the mainstream media have gone into that tack of either being extreme one way or the other. And we've lost that ability to simply have civil discourse on certain issues and to hear both sides. And so you've got media outlets in New Zealand who are refusing to even allow a dissenting voice to certain issues. For example, climate change. If you go against the narrative that, we should all be alarmed and we're all going to be toast shortly or drowned, then, you're just not allowed to have that opinion. If you believe that a person is born a male or a female, and that men shouldn't go into women's spaces, changing rooms or toilets, then you'll be shut down. You'll be cancelled. So unfortunately, that's not helping. It's creating a further divide. But I think that's probably a westernised problem anyway, isn't it, Neil? Because, I've been following your giggle versus tickle case with interest because it reflects everything that's happening in New Zealand as well in terms of this confusion around who we are as male and female.
The confusion reigns everywhere, and I think listeners will recognise the truth in what you're saying, in that media has become polarised, and you'll have some that are considered progressive media and others that are considered a little more conservative, but oftentimes there's a lot of progressive elements there as well. But there's this polarisation. You're either on one side or another. You aren't able to reflect and argue and actually come to your own critical thinking judgment if you're only listening to one form of media. Hey, let's stay with the economic agenda for a few moments. Just a few notes that I took in some bit of research. Practically everything that the big ticket items that Jacinda Ardern was pushing. Things like the Auckland Light Rail and the Lake Onslow pumped hydro scheme, they've been axed. The Reserve Bank's employment mandate was gone. Ardern's re-regulation of the labour markets and subsidy schemes for electric vehicles, all gone. The Luxon government has abolished the controversial Three Waters program, which would have put the nation's water infrastructure under co-governance with the Maori. Those sorts of things. Lots of economic issues. It really just very quickly, because they only came to power in October last year. There's very quick change there, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think they picked up the mood of the country that a lot of these things sounded interesting, but they really didn't deliver practical solutions, and a lot of them were built on not uniting the country to deal with an issue. It was dividing the country, and especially around the race issues. So I think National have come into power. The difficulty for National is that they didn't have, in the last 3 years of Jacinda's reign, although she left after 2 of those years because she saw the writing on the wall. And I mean, that's interesting in itself, because the international media thought she was the best thing that ever happened, but she became very, very unpopular in New Zealand, and that's why she left even before the election, before New Zealanders had a chance to say, actually, we don't want to vote for you. And so, as you mentioned in your intro, Labour crashed. But, National have come in and they've tried to, I think in some ways they're trying to unite the country and say these problems are common to all of us. But of course, you are getting a lot of resistance from both the media, and most of our mainstream media is predominantly left-wing. We've seen that in surveys of journalists and of the media in general. So we've got the problem with that. But also you've now got the Māori, who I think under Jacinda Ardern thought that they were going to get some major gains, and then suddenly they've gone. So though, they're very disgruntled about that, and that's creating division as well, which is stoked up by the media, rather than us all come together as one nation and say, okay, those in need are the people that we should be focusing on. So that's the debate still to be had. Look, they are doing some practical things. They've gone away from the light rail, but they want to build roads of significance that enable people to travel around the country, more in cars. They've done away with the rebate on the electric cars. Ironically, Christopher Luxon's wife actually benefited from that rebate, which everybody laughed about. But they've done away with some of those types of things. And actually, I tell you what, Neil, last Friday was one of the coldest days we've had this year, and we were told by the National Power Grid that we all had to try not to use the power on Friday morning, the coldest morning this year so far, because our power supplies aren't up, the wind farms aren't generating enough energy. So these are some of the issues that we're having to have a reality check on. They sound good in theory, but they're actually not delivering for New Zealanders.
You're not painting a bright picture of what's happening in New Zealand. It's a little bit gloomy. Where do you stand so far as one of the primary voices, a Christian voice in those corridors of power, and you're meeting with MPs and you're discussing these things? Where does a Christian sit in the mix of what's been going on in New Zealand? Because no side is perfect. Where do we sit as Christians and think about the sorts of things that have happened there?
Well, I think the concern for us is that the Parliament, even though you have what we call centre-left, centre-right parties, the centre-right have moved to the left. In terms of social and moral issues, they're very liberal. They've voted, most of the centre-right parties, MPs, all voted for banning so-called conversion therapy. They voted for the radical abortion law, which Jacinda Ardern championed, and which has resulted in a 25% increase in the number of abortions. They voted for the euthanasia. They voted for birth certificates. The whole Parliament voted for birth certificates to be based on gender, not on biological sex. So a birth certificate is basically a piece of ideology now. It means absolutely nothing in a factual sense. So Parliament has, even though it's supposed to be centre-right, centre-left fiscally, in terms of moral issues, social issues, it's moved to the left overall. And so it leaves basically, I would say maybe two handfuls, sometimes one handful, it feels like, a handful of MPs who are willing to stand up and be bold on some of these controversial social issues. For example, around even the whole gender ideology being taught in schools. Interestingly enough, Winston Peters, who was head of one of the coalition parties, they got about 6% of the vote, so they had about 8 MPs under our system. They've just introduced a bill that says that for a public toilet, for any new public toilets to be built, you've got to have a male, a female, and an intersex toilet, so that if you can't figure out if you're male or female, then there's another option without a dude going into a female toilet. And this is the kind of complexities you have to deal with when we can't tell basic biological facts. So, I actually came over and spoke at the Church and State Conference in both Brisbane when I saw you last, Neil,
yep.
And also in Tasmania. And as I sit there, I just think, we could say exactly the same things in New Zealand as what's being spoken in Australia. And probably when I shared, it was all the same things that Australians can see, is happening in Australia as well. So it is part of the Western culture.
Hey, Bob, how are things looking from where you stand around things like families? Sometimes we talk about what's happening with families, family breakdown, family dysfunction. There's all sorts of issues like suicides and family violence and child abuse. Where are those sorts of things for New Zealanders right now?
Well, I think if you look at any of those particular areas, you'll find that we have terrible rates in terms of the OECD. I read just last week that we've got one of the worst bullying rates in schools in the OECD. Our child abuse rate is one of the worst. In fact, I'm just looking at the homepage of our major newspaper, the New Zealand Herald, and it's about a gang unit being set up to crack down on violence and drug crime. We've had a mass increase in violence and drug-related crimes. And of course, I mean, we saw that horrific situation in Australia as well in the shopping centre. And in fact, we've had a couple of those, not quite as dramatic as that, not quite as tragic, but, ram raids. And what's most concerning is that they often happen in a shopping centre during the day. It's no longer these in the middle of the night when no one's there. The bravado, the no caring for the consequences. So that's one policy that the government has just announced, is the return of the 3 strikes legislation, which is for repeat violent offenders. And it's basically it was done away with by the Labor government, by Jacinda Ardern's government. And I think the other real concern is mental health, especially around young people. And, one of the arguments is that because of the amount of screen time children are getting and social media, that children are now moving from what you and I had, Neil, which was a play-based childhood, to now it's a screen-based childhood. And kids are growing up with screens, they're growing up with the images, they're growing up with the hardcore pornography, which is, constantly available on social media. And there has to be some hard conversations. And, to be honest, Neil, I hear that there are some good conversations starting up in Australia around porn, age verification, social media, the effect of that. We're still struggling to get that discussion happening, even after the Cass report came out of the UK regarding the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for gender-confused children. We're still struggling to get any traction on that. And part of the reason is because we don't have a sort of centre-right media outlet. It's only left-wing, and so they won't go near it. They'll sort of report it, but then they'll immediately run to some advocate in New Zealand who thinks, no, we should chemicalise and castrate kids. So, yeah, it's an uphill battle, but we've got to be, as they say, you may not win every battle, but you've got to turn up in the first place.
Honour to you, Bob, because you're in the centre of where that battle is happening and you're bringing a Christian voice. And, there's going to be all sorts of needs that you're going to have in the times ahead, the sort of support that you need to grow the organisation that you're leading there, Family First New Zealand. Hey, sometimes we blame a lot of the things that are happening right now with the confusion and the unsettledness of where our nations might be on the cost of living crisis, and no doubt there's a huge contributing factor there. I wonder if you've got a thought on the influence of government policies when it comes to all of these things we're talking about too, with family breakdown and violence and child abuse and all of these issues. So cost of living, it's obviously exacerbating things, but what about government policy and all of that? Where do you see things?
Well, I think the cost of living has been used as an excuse for a whole lot of things that shouldn't be blamed on the cost of living, because the argument has been that if you're poor, you'll abuse your kids, and if you're poor, you'll commit violent crimes. And if you're poor, you'll end up in prison. The fact of the matter is that for families who are really struggling and who are making ends meet, who are making sacrifices, for them to be told, oh, because you're poor, you're going to treat your kids like dirt and there's going to be family violence, and they're actually getting through it, and they're, it's a challenge, but they're working hard at it. So this cost of living statement, yes, it's absolutely true for many families, and unfortunately we had a government that spent money like it was going out of fashion, and to the point where we just spend copious amounts of money every day just on the interest on the loan over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, what the government's trying to do is to make some changes to basically get their books in order. I think it would be nice, Neil, if we could be like a government and we could just spend and borrow as much as we liked and everybody would applaud us because we're investing in such and such. But the fact of the matter is we have to make our books balance, and the government needs to do the same as well. And so I think that's what the new government is doing. They've cut down on the public service, which became very bloated. But of course, that brings criticism as well. And so it is this balance. But we've had this big inflation that is starting to come down. I think it is, or maybe it's just sort of reached its peak and we're hoping it starts to come down. So interest rates have gone up for people with home ownership. That means that when they renew their mortgage, they're going to have higher rates. So that's a real concern for families. And there is a housing shortage as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of social issues that need to be fixed up. But I think you alluded to the fact that nothing sort of really can cause such financial challenge as family breakdown. That can be a real problem. It not only causes the emotional stress, but it also causes fiscal stress in terms of needing more than one house, just the breakdown in the relationship, and even just couples living together and then breaking up. That all has an ongoing effect. And that's part of the reason that people argue, because our marriage rate has declined to about being, I think our marriage rate is a fifth of what it was in 1971. So 50 years ago, it was our marriage rate was 5 times higher. And in that same time period, our birth rate, our fertility rate has also declined. So you can see we've got weakly formed families, and we've got families that aren't having children, and so we're having to rely on immigration to meet some of the needs, and we've got an well. And the fact of the matter is, when I retire, I'm hoping I get some superannuation or something, but we need workers. We need the younger workforce coming through. So they call it the demographic winter, and I think Australia faces that as well. So it's a common Western problem.
That's right. Baby boomers are all about to hit 60. There won't be anyone younger than that. And of course, baby boomers are going to die en masse. Sorry to be so blunt with that for anyone who's over 60. Let me ask you about the churches, Bob, because you're well connected with the denominational leaders. Is there a united voice amongst the church leaders in New Zealand, or is it a fragmentation? How do you describe it?
I think the difficulty is that behind the scenes they are united. They do meet together. There's a number of coalitions of pastors from various denominations, and so I'm aware of that unity. I think the difficulty for the churches is that with our hostile media to things from the church in general, it means that for a church to put their head up, they either have to be very well prepared for a backlash, and often I totally understand, and often I say to the church leaders, look, we're happy to take the flak. We've already been cancelled, so we're happy to speak up on some of these issues. We understand that you're taking a more pastoral approach. You've got a church, family to pastor and look after. And so therefore they don't, in some ways I understand they don't want to get involved in the fight, but we do encourage them and try to provide resources so that they can equip their church members to get involved in the process, stand for the local school board, make submissions to Parliament or local council. So it doesn't mean that they just go silent. It just means that they strategically encourage church members to get involved at a local level with families in their communities. But, if you put your head up above the parapet in terms of a national sense and with national media, unfortunately, we do have a very hostile media. And so therefore, for some of them, they think, do we want this flak? And I can understand why, often they don't. But somehow we've got to lock arms together like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego did, and, and make our stand.
You know, there's one body, many parts, and parachurch organisations like yours that can straddle the boundaries of denominations and be a Christian voice. This just demonstrates, doesn't it, the need for lobbying organisations like yours that can present a point and can make a point and be outspoken. You know how to address the media. And you're not afraid of the backlash because, as you say, Bob, I mean, and humbly, you've already been cancelled. How many times can you be cancelled? You've been cancelled. But this is the necessity, isn't it, for a parachurch group to be able to speak up on behalf of those denominational leaders?
Yeah, and I think, that's why I take my hat off to groups like Australian Christian Lobby. I mean, when I started Family First, one of the first things I did was come over and see Jim Wallace, who was at the time, that's how long ago it was, he was heading it up, and then spent a lot of time with Lyle Shelton as well, and Martin Isles, and now Michelle. And so, you need groups like ACL and the Australian Family Association, and there's many others. I come over regularly for the Church and State Conference with Dave Pallow. So these are examples of where groups can be involved at a political level, sort of a media level, and churches can work in the background. And we do enjoy good support from church leaders. They encourage us, and sometimes they financially support where they can, and we really appreciate that. But I do understand our role is to sometimes stand up in the heat to speak up on some of these issues, and we expect that heat because there's a very hostile reaction to some of our views now, as you well know, Neil. And, that's one of my messages that I've been bringing when I've spoken in Australia over the last year, is that we're living in a new, there's a new religious culture in our Western society, and it rejects many of the biblical truths that we hold dearly. For example, around being created male and female, about what marriage is, about God creating the heaven and the earth, around the whole areas of sexuality, and not only homosexuality, but adultery, pornography. There are standards within Scripture that the world just rejects and mocks. And so we have to understand that there's a new cultural religion that is now, creeping into overtaking our countries, and we need to decide whether we are willing to stand no matter the consequences.
Bob, let me ask you about enemies and friends here for a moment, because, as you say, you speak up and you're attracting the flack, and there are enemies of the Christian voice. But when you do speak up, clearly those who have been going along with the flow, in the current, blinkered, you might say, when they are hearing an alternative perspective, when they're hearing the Christian foundation, the Christian perspective in all of these ethical issues, you must be making friends as well. There'd be friends, maybe they're a little bit hidden, but they're friends, aren't they, that you're making, that are telling you, hey, Bob, you're doing a great job.
Yeah, one of my favourite quotes is from Reverend Billy Graham, who said, when a brave man takes a stand, it stiffens the spines of others. And I think that's true, that when men and women stand up and have courage and, hold firm, it gives backbone, gives strength to others to say, hey, I agree with that. And so, I think, and a lot of people probably listen to your station because they simply say, hey, that's what I'm thinking as well. It's great to know that I'm not the only one. And that's a common sentiment that you hear. And so, yeah, we definitely make friends. But I think, as you say, when you stand up above the parapet and hold to certain values, you do make enemies. One thing that I've really tried to constantly remind myself is that we don't battle against people. We don't battle against flesh and blood. We battle against principalities and powers, and it's the views, it's the ideologies. And I think that's really important for us to remember in the culture at the moment, is that as much as we may not like the person that's saying it, they're simply reflecting an ideology that has embedded itself in our culture, and we've got to take the people along with us and explain the problems with that ideology and the outcomes. So, for example, I think in the whole area of transitioning kids to try and be the opposite sex, for so many years we struggled because we didn't have any really solid research or backing as to why it was wrong. We knew it was wrong deep down, but we struggled to really pronunciate it in a way that people could understand. Now we've got studies out of Sweden, out of the Netherlands. We've got the CAS report out of the NHS. We're seeing the detransitioners, and now it's kind of like, hey, we were right, and here's the evidence to back up what we thought. And so that's why we're starting to see a tipping point. That's just one example of ideology. We had the same problem with the drugs debate, and I know that the drugs debate is sort of simmering in Australia as well, because I see the emails from groups that I'm involved with in that area. And, back in 2020, we had a referendum in New Zealand. Theoretically, we should have lost it. The media were certainly pumping for marijuana to be legalised. Somehow we managed to persuade New Zealanders and we got across the line just and stopped that. And really it meant we had to think of arguments and present the facts in a way that those people would understand it. As much as we didn't like their viewpoint, we had to see beyond that and see that it was ideology and it was principalities and powers that were driving this desire for drugs and to be out of it and not to be, in reality. So I think that's a really important thing we need to understand in all of this culture war that's going on.
It is a culture war that is going on, and when you've got a one-sided media, and I think listeners who've been listening to our conversation since the beginning, you've picked up something pretty important about New Zealand, where there's no real conservative voice. There's a lower level Christian voice in the media marketplace. And this just brings into contrast, and I'll get your thoughts here, Bob, because all of the confusing, ideologically driven way that people think about gender and sexuality and dismantling those definitions of family, the ability to present a married biological parent family model isn't there. You need to have the alternative to be able to say, this is what mum and dad and the kids look like when there is a Christian ethic that's employed in family. If you haven't got that, you're in a real challenging spot, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think the social sciences, that's where we can use it to our benefit, because we know that from decades of research that the best model, it's not perfect, but the best model by far is where the biological male and female who have created the child are committed to each other to raise that child. You can't beat that model. There is no research showing that there is a better model than that. Now, unfortunately, it involves humans, so it's not always perfect. We know that marriage is perfectly designed, but it's not perfect because humans are involved, and that's the same with parenting as well. But what we did was we commissioned some reports around, we got a social scientist to examine, for example, child abuse rates, poverty, imprisonment, and we got them to examine what were the factors most likely to lead to those situations and what type of families were most at risk of those negative outcomes. And in every case, the least risk, it was in a nuclear family where mum and dad were married and committed to the children. Like I say, it wasn't perfect, but it was the best model by far. The safest place for a woman to be in a family is where she's married to the husband. Once again, there are exceptions, but exceptions often prove the norm. The safest place from family violence is in a married family. The safest place for a child to be is in where mum and dad are married, biological parents. The riskiest place for a child to be, by something, I think the research was around 50 times higher risk, is where mum has a live-in boyfriend who's changing on a regular basis. That child is 50 times at risk of child abuse.
A little bit of breaking up on our signal here with this link. Let's hope that just corrects itself, Bob. Hey, the interesting thing is, let's hope we can get things right here. The interesting thing is that with all of this confusion around marriage and what is the best married biological parent model that actually is the best for the kids, whenever you talk about that, though, that's being labelled as an attack on solo parents or an attack on divorcees. Somehow or other, you've got to be able to deal with all sorts of criticisms from a lot of different areas and get your message cutting through that what you have with a married biological parent, male, female, mother, father family is something to be celebrated, but it's actually under attack from so many different directions.
Yeah, and I think I've had discussions with solo parents because, I know many dear Christian solo parents who, as I say, are doing a double shift. And I've said to them, how do you feel when this statement is said that, one of the strongest models is for mum and dad to be married? And they themselves say, yeah, totally understand that. They understand that what they're doing is more difficult for us to. They're doing their best. I think church families are really, because we provide that support, encouragement to, for example, solo mums or solo dads around their kids and need that practical support. So it's acknowledgement that we're all in some way, but without denying perfect is given us, which we understand that unfortunately humans aren't always perfect on. We only need to read the heroes of the faith didn't always get it right. Doesn't deny of the perfect plan or perfect.
Okay, there is a little bit of a challenge with our link now, and things breaking up a little. If I can just get you on one more thing here, and I don't want to end on a really negative note. A lot of things that we've been talking about in New Zealand have been quite gloomy. A lot of Aussies love to come to New Zealand for a holiday, Bob, and I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts here. Is this a great time of year? I mean, I can see you as we're talking today. You're all rugged up. Those who are anywhere in the north of Australia are still feeling pretty good. It's not wintry here yet. It's a little bit of wintry conditions coming in our south, but, a holiday in New Zealand. What's so good about... Let's give you an opportunity here. Your best sales pitch for having a holiday in New Zealand. What should we know?
Well, if you love ski, you can't miss going to because the ski field and some up north. Of course, it comes... always a wonderful thing. And the welcome is as well.
Bob,
people don't like the hot.
No, our link is just not good enough to be able to continue, and we're almost to the end of our conversation. So we'll have to draw an end to our conversation. But for listeners, Bob McCoskrie is the founder of the Family First New Zealand. He's national director, and he's like the equivalent of our Australian Christian lobby here in Australia. And for listeners, and there's a lot of listeners who'll be connected in some way to family back home in New Zealand, well, you might want to check in and even become a supporter of family of the Family First in New Zealand. Here's the website, familyfirst.nz. familyfirst.nz. Bob McCoskrie, thanks so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and give us an update. Faith and politics in New Zealand's been so enlightening. Really appreciate you and appreciate you being with us and listeners today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.